The United Nations grievance industry, that is the topic of tonight's byline. When I was a kid, my family had a rule. We could badmouth each other all we want, but an outsider, well, they were in trouble if they took one of us on. They took on all of us in that case. And I know a lot of families operated like that. Many still do. And you'd think it might be like that with your country as well. Canadians take great offense if some Yankee says something bad about Canada. That is, unless that Yankee is a lefty or a UN official. Well, then the media opposition complex cheer and give voice to their complaints. And so it is with James Anaya, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He reports to the UN Human Rights Council. You know, that stellar body that has Algeria, China, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE on its roster. So this is the group that Anaya, who spent just a few days in the country last year, reports to. And he sounded like he'd made his mind up before he even left.
Over the past several days, I've collected a significant amount of information from Indigenous peoples and government representatives across the country. In the following weeks, I will be reviewing the extensive information I received during the visit in order to develop a report to evaluate the situation of Indigenous peoples in Canada and to make a series of recommendations. This report will be made public and will be presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council.
Now, most interesting was Anaya's use of the word crisis before he'd left Canada and before he'd even written his report.
From all I have learned, I can only conclude that Canada faces a crisis when it comes to the situation of Indigenous peoples.
That was Anaya after just 9 days in the country, so it wasn't a big surprise that his report uses the word crisis several times. It's also unsurprising that CBC picked up the report and sang like an Alleluia choir, an Alleluia chorus repeating Anaya's term crisis over and over again without ever questioning it.
James Anaya spent 9 days last year touring reserves. He'd already said the country is facing a crisis. The message is not a surprise, nor is it sugar-coated, actually.
It's being called a crisis situation.
A crisis in education, a crisis in healthcare, a crisis in women's rights.
Even though governments have put forward lots of money, they're not keeping pace with the crisis.
The picture, Andrew, is dire.
There's a crisis, don't you know? Look, I've been in this game a long time. Here's one thing I can tell you. If this were a government report issued by a cabinet minister that was saying good things about Native issues, or pick any topic, if it came from the Harper government, well, then every reporter, every guest would be questioning the report. They would be criticizing it until late in the day. At some point, they'd finally get a conservative partisan on for a few minutes to defend the report on a 3-on-1 panel. But do you ever notice when there's a negative report about the government, the CBC and most of the media opposition complex just run with it. They parrot it. They quote it liberally. It's almost like they're cheering. And so it is with this report. No one is going to sit here and say that things are hunky-dory with Canada's Native population. Simply not true. It would be wrong to claim otherwise. But let's also not claim that this government or any government in Canada in recent memory has ignored problems facing Native communities across the country. Just recently, the feds put forward major changes to the Education Act for reserves. Sean Atleo, the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, he championed the bill. He said it moved in the right direction and said that education was key to improving the outcomes on reserves and communities across the land. Yet, in the face of stiff opposition from a radical faction within the AFN, he resigned his post. The bill, a real chance to change the schooling system for Indian and Métis kids across the country, could end up dying like so many attempts at reform in the past. When the media opposition complex talk about this story, what do they talk about? Well, of course, they give preference to the critics. They talk about how the government isn't doing enough. Last year, the Fed spent $8.6 billion on Indian and Northern affairs. But that's not the whole story. You can go through the main estimates, the government's detailed spending plan, and find all kinds of other budgetary items. Here's 3 from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Aboriginal Strategy and Governance, $54 million. Increased Native participation in commercial fisheries, $26 million. Aboriginal Aquatic Resource and Oceans Management Program, $14 million. That's an additional $95.9 million just from that department. Other departments are similar. At Canadian Heritage, contributions to support the Aboriginal Peoples Program, $11.5 million. At Justice, Contributions to the provinces under the Aboriginal Court Work Program, $4.9 million. Natural Resources Canada, a contribution to the Aboriginal Forestry Initiative, $1 million. You can go through department after department and see grants, contributions, programs. Public Health alone spends $32 million on early intervention programs with children. Money is spent, programs are there, but along comes James Anaya and the UN to say it's not enough. Well, guess what? It's never going to be enough, but the UN, which has trouble doing its real job, decides it's through its Human Rights Council to report on Canada, talk about how bad things are here, and the media opposition complex cheer him along. Just like the food rapporteur, Scooter, who told us we're all too fat, or the rights of women rapporteur, who told us that we're all sexist, Canadians should ignore this report like they did with the previous ones. This is a country that, for all its problems, has a far better track record of dealing with real-world problems, of offering freedom, rule of law, a social safety net. I mean, other than corruption, which the UN excels at, Canada beats the UN at every measure. It's time to ignore this report. It's time to leave the UN. And that's the byline.